Right, so sorry, as I was saying, if there are technical issues, I will be back. So hopefully you're still with me and you haven't gone anywhere. Just so that we've got a kind of a context of where we're starting. We're starting in the Heath Road car park, and just to give you some idea of where the place that I'm talking about as we go along. But there's a lot to get through. Like I said, over 8,000 years worth of history. So we're going to get going at one of the earliest sites of man being on the Heath. So let's go. We are walking along this. I will try and show you some of the views as we're going along, so it's not just my face that you are looking at. There will also be times where I won't be saying anything. I haven't gone anywhere. I am just going around there. I will try not to get too distracted by dog walkers as well, which is something I tend to do. I was looking at the clouds just before that I came out for this walk, and I was a little bit dubious, so I have got an umbrella in my back pocket just in case, but I'm holding off the fact that it's going to rain. So there is the comments bar at the bottom. Obviously I can't see or answer any of your questions, so if you have got any, please feel free to put in the comments any questions that you might have or any things that you might want to add to my discussion and talk. Helicopter flying over, hopefully you can still hear me. But we're just going over, like I said, to one of the first places where we know human activity on the Heath was happening. Now, a lot of this evidence that we're going to talk about, particularly in prehistory, comes from a project called the People of the Heath Project, which was an archaeological excavations, the first archaeological excavations taken place on the Heath over its entire history, led by Petersfield Museum, and it was mainly to look at later prehistoric activity. But what we discovered on this plateau, this rise that we've just walked up, in this area that we're looking at here, was a Mesolithic campsite. So the Mesolithic, or the Middle Stone Age, was the Stone Age about 9,500 years ago, and the people at that time were hunter-gatherers. The temperature was much warmer, and they would move from campsite to campsite following the game that they were going to hunt, and living their lives in fairly temporary structures. So it is very difficult sometimes to find out where they actually stopped. You might find their tools, you might find a little bit of evidence for them, but very rarely do you find where they stop. But just up here, probably around about where you can see on the camera now, we actually found a fireplace, a hearth. So it started off with finding tens of thousands of worked flints. These are the tools that they were making. They're very small flint tools called microliths, and we find tens of thousands over here, so no doubt that they had been here. But then we came across this fireplace, this burnt area of ground, which was their fireplace, which is very rare to find this evidence. It's great. We found it here on Petersfield Heath around 9,500 years ago. They were here, and they kept coming back. There are layers of these flints, so this was part of their nomadic route. They would come here. And why would they come here? Well, apart from the wonderful view, which I'll share with you now, this view would have been very different. Heathland is a man-made environment, and it wasn't a heathland at the time that these Mesolithic hunters were here. It was in fact a deciduous woodland, oak, elm, hazel around the outside of it, and it would have been a very wooded area. And over towards the pond, which we talk about a bit later, which is in that direction, it would have been very wet and boggy. This would have made it an attractive area for animals to come, and so if the animals are coming here, the hunter-gatherers, the Mesolithic people, are going to come here, and they set up shop here, like I said, on this rise, on the high ground overlooking that, and they would have made their flint tools. Like I said, tens of thousands of flints, and they would have hunted in this land here, all over there. All of those flints are coming back to Petersfield Museum at some point, and we've got to work out what to do with them, but there are some fantastic examples of flints there, and they were here. And like I said, I think it's amazing to think that on our heathland here we have got this campsite, a very rare archaeological example of where these Mesolithic hunter-gatherers were living. We're now going to go down to what I think is a unique site in the UK, if not the world. I'll explain that once we get there. But just to kind of get to that time point, After the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, we move on to the Neolithic. And this is when heathland really start getting made around the country. The Neolithic people were the first farmers. They discovered to grow crops and to keep animals. And so they needed land in order to do this. So they started felling trees and making clearings, slash and burn techniques where they were setting fire, because it's a lot easier to burn down trees than to cut them down with a flint axe. And these large areas were cleared. And around that time, it seems to be that Petersfield Heath was also made. And we're talking about 7,000, 6,000 years ago, somewhere like that. And they're clearing these large areas. Now, we don't have much evidence. There's not all that. What we do have is the pollen analysis of lots of burnt grains and seeds that we're finding, which go to show that this went through the same slash and burn technique that we kind of are thinking that was happening for the Neolithic farmers. But we don't know where they were living. Unlike the Mesolithic floor, we haven't found where they were living, which is odd. But hopefully one day we will. So that was happening here. What we do have is, instead of this kind of going forwards in time, what we do have is a little bit of evidence that says that people were here even earlier than the Mesolithic, actually all the way back to the Paleolithic. The archaeologists, when they were excavating on the sites, discovered I think about 12 different worked flints, which came from a technology from the Old Stone Age, so the Paleolithic, which is about 10,000 years ago. Now, it's difficult to say whether this meant that they were here 10,000 years ago. There's a number of different reasons why such an old technology might have been found in and around the area, but it's definitely a question mark raised as to whether not only were people staying here on that high rise doing their hunt and gathering 9,000 years ago, but whether anyone was here 10,000 years ago. Now, there was one thing that I didn't check when I did my checks of whether the signal worked at all, and that was whether there would be cricket going on. And there is. So if anyone sees a cricket ball flying towards my head, if you could make a comment or just like the video at this point, then that'd be great. But this does take us to, like I said, what I consider to be a unique site in the United Kingdom, not just because we're playing cricket, but actually because of what is behind me here. So if many of you have been to Petersfield Heath, or if you visit after this talk, you'll notice that there are a number of strange mounds or hills dotted around the heath. These aren't natural. These actually come from the next phase of definitive human use of the heath, and that is the early Bronze Age. So we're talking about 4,000 years ago now. So from 9,000 years in the Mesolithic to 4,000 years, we've got Bronze Age people. And what they're using the heath for is burying their dead. And what we're looking at here, these mounds, the one just at the back of the screen here, and the one in front of me, these are burial mounds called barrows or round barrows. Now, Petersfield Heath is one of the largest examples of a burial site from this period in the southeast of England. There are 23 barrows that you can go and see on Petersfield Heath today, but in the area at the time it's thought that there could have been as many as 31, and this is huge. And there's a range of barrow types as well. They come in bowl barrows like these ones here, which are the most common. They just look like an upside down bowl. But you also get ring barrows and bell barrows, and we have examples of the most common as well as the rarest examples here. Inside these mounds are the burials, quite often cremations in urns, but they could be inhumations where people are buried in coffins. Because of the sandy, acidic nature of heathland soil, it means that there is very poor preservation. So it's very hard to find the actual human remains. So when we find cremations, that's kind of the exception. And there have been a number found. 17 of the barrows have been excavated as part of the People at Heath project. A number of them contain burials, and they've all been excavated. And we're learning lots from about them, and that information is all coming out in a publication later on, or at the beginning of next year, and as well will be in the new museum when we reopen, but can also be found on the People at the Heath website. But we have these wonderful barrows, and I keep saying about a unique site, and that is because around the cricket pitch there are 6 or 7 of these barrows, and I think it must be the only cricket pitch in the country, if not the world, that is being made into or being built in amongst a Bronze Age burial site. Now, cricket is actually something that goes along with the history of the Heath. Cricket was first played in Petersfield from about 1751, and at that time the cricket pitch was actually up by the railway station, just next to where the steam laundry is now. So in that land where the tile factory is at the moment, it used to be the original cricket pitch. It moved to the Heath in 1856 and has been played here ever since. The cricket pavilion, which is just behind me and you can't see because I'm not going to stray onto the pitch. The original pavilion was built in 1881 but burnt down in 1973. It was a thatched pavilion. It burnt down in 1973. Suspected arson, I believe, and it was rebuilt after that. As well as cricket, there's been a number of recreational uses for the Heath, and they all date back to around the same sort of time, the early 17th century and beyond. Golf. It was played or started being played on the Heath in the 1890s to 91 when a 9-hole golf course was put in there, and over the years it expanded and contracted. In 1911 it grew to have another 9-hole golf course on it, and it continued that history until the Petersfield golf course moved in 1994. And of course we started the walk close to the original golf clubhouse, which is now the little school by the lake. Football has also been played on the Heath, and that started from about 1886, was the first match was mentioned, where the Petersfield team was playing a friendly with Portsmouth and lost 6-1. But it continued and it established. The first Petersfield team, football team, was called the Petersfield Dragons, and they played on a pitch just near the junction of Sussex Road, which unfortunately can't be seen there today. And they finished playing their games on the Heath in about 1908. Other sports that have been played on the Heath, all around this area of the Heath. We had hockey being played. There's a Petersfield ladies hockey team. Again, starting in the 1800s. There was also tennis courts, 2 grass and 2 hard courts from 1925 to 1940, and as well as tennis, they were used by a netball team. So an awful lot of recreational uses for the Heath, and all this time set in this prehistoric landscape. The environment of the Heath itself being a man-made ancient landscape, but also these barrows, which we can see around as we go, and I'll point some more out as we go. Some are visible, but some, if I pan the camera around, there would be one barrow in front of me there that you wouldn't see except for using archaeological equipment like geophysics, but it's there. So we have this fantastic continuous use really from the Mesolithic, possibly even as far back as the Paleolithic, all the way through to the Victorian periods and beyond. So we've got the Bronze Age. We know that they were burying their mounds in the early Bronze Age. And then it doesn't seem odd, but human activity then starts petering out. We don't have much evidence from the Middle or Late Bronze Age. There are some new holes dug in the barrows, and that's about it really. And that goes on towards the Iron Age and even the Romans. There is very little archaeological evidence that we found of their use on the Heath, which is very strange. But then we start coming on to the medieval period. Now, the medieval period, and at this time, even in prehistory, the Heath is much larger than it is today. We don't know exactly how big, but when it starts getting mapped in the 18th and 19th century, the map showed it's about 245 acres in comparison to the almost 91 acres it is today. So it was much bigger. And what was happening was it was becoming used as common ground. So it was no good for farming. The soil wasn't good. It had been over cultivated, so the nutrition was going. It wasn't any good for growing crops, and so it was used for things like grazing animals. You could also come on here and dig up peat for your fuels, but also heather and bracken, and use those natural materials for fuel, for bedding, for thatch, for your buildings. It was common land, so commoners were able to use that. As we go into the medieval period, that kind of starts getting established, but ownership starts becoming something as well. Now, prior to the 12th century, we have no record of the town of Petersfield. It didn't exist. What did exist was the manor of Maple Dresham, which is now the parish of Burriton. That was owned by William the Conqueror's wife, Matilda, and she owned the manor, and that manor extended up and included all this area, including the heathland. Now, later on in the early 1200s, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, he takes over, and he owns the manor of Maple Dresham, or Burriton, and he decides to set up a market town, to the north of his property, which turns out to be Petersfield. So a crossroads, and he establishes a church, St. Peter's, which is where we get the town's name from. And once he's established this, we started getting a little bit of confusion with ownership. There's in fact 3 different parishes at different times that kind of the land of the Heath encompasses. It's the borough of Petersfield, the parish of Maple Dresham or Burriton, and also Sheet and Nurstead. And they all link, and they're all boundaries that cut across the heath, which means that there are lots of disputes from local residents and the commoners as to who has what rights. And we'll look at some of those kind of conflicts a little bit later on, because they are synonymous with the heathland. And so in this medieval period, you have this kind of use of the heathland to graze cattle and sheep. Less sheep, because they would have been on the downs, but definitely cattle, and people coming out for the gorse and the heather. And it's owned by the lord of the manor at the time. And like I said, to start off with, that was from the manor in Burriton, and later it becomes split between Petersfield, Nurstead and Sheet, and Burriton itself, and Petersfield itself, sorry. So it's split. From fairly early on, there's a lot of military use for Petersfield Heath. The military, like encamping on here, probably came as early as the First English Civil War, when we know that a number of parliamentarian and royalist troops came through the town, and they would have camped on, we think they would have camped on the Heath. There's no major evidence for it, but we're talking about thousands of troops being camped here in a town that probably is no bigger than 1,000 people at the time, or roughly, so a huge influx. So they've got to go somewhere, and where they go is on the Heath. You can pitch your tents easily in the sandy soil. You can also have the water for your horses. And it's a large open space to house a lot of people. So as early as the English Civil War, we definitely know that by the 1800s, we have the Oxford Light Infantry come and have an encampment here. And around this area as well, this scar in the landscape over here is a result of quarrying for sand from the Heath, but is used in the past a number of times for putting up bathhouses, as it's sunk and it's hidden slightly, for troops to camp in, and they'd have been camping around the rest of the place. My favourite story of military use is in 1943, where the Marines came and did some training in the Heath Pond. They were doing diving training, and it's reported that, again, they camped around this area. They built a jetty out into the pond, and they went and did their diving practice, in which they had to wear heavy boots to make sure they sank. Now, I can't imagine diving in the Heath Pond today. I don't know if anyone else can. It kind of gives me the shivers. But they were out there and they were training for that. So the reason why that I've come up to this area is because this is a natural rise in the Heath, and this area is called Music Hill. And this is an area where it's named basically after all the musical events that used to happen here. So during the Victorian period, a town brass band was set up, and they used to hold concerts here. And over the years, military bands have played concerts here. The church's college have held fundraisers here during the wars. So lots of stuff going on here. Again, recreational use in this area. But what's most fascinating about Music Hill, and I'm yet to trial this one out, but apparently it is the best place to stand to hear the bells of St. Peter's. And one day I will get out here and try and find that perfect sound where it's the ideal place to hear the peals of St. Peter's. But lots of military use, and we found this as well in our archaeological digs on the Heath. We found empty cartridges dating mostly from the First World War and the Second World War, when again the Home Guard around the time would have been using the area for drill practice and for general practice of drills and manoeuvres. We're now going to head to probably the most iconic element of the Heath and the part that most people talk about, and also one of the areas that brings up the most controversy. And it's not that controversial, but the question is, and I can ask you this, and please comment in your answers, but we're about to head over to Petersfield Pond or Lake, and it would be interesting to know whether you would call it a pond or a lake. It's always one of those that different books, different signposts, different variations of councils over the years have called it all different things. So it'd be interesting to know. I know there's lots of debate that goes on, friendly debate, luckily, but a pond or a lake. But we're going to head over that way now because it's a large part of the aesthetic of the Heath, and something that everyone kind of knows about in Petersfield, as well as the heathland behind me. So behind me is still where all the prehistoric landscape is. 27 remaining barrows from the 31, Mesolithic campsites from people living here 9,000 years ago. And then we're coming up to the pond or lake. The pond or lake is completely man-made, and there's a very practical reason as to why they dug the pond. So if you remember, I said during the medieval period there was lots of you could come to the Heath and you were able to dig for peat for fuel. That's all very well and good, but where there's a boggy area like the Heath was, you end up making kind of a morass bog even worse, with deeper holes in. And this was becoming a problem for local cattle who were drowning in these holes and getting stuck. Unfortunately, I don't think we found evidence of any humans dying in accidents in these holes, but we definitely have cattle. And of course, this time for the commoners who were grazing on here, they're kind of important, those cattle, to their livelihood. So they wanted to do something about it. So in 1735, there was a petition made in order to have the Heath or the pond dug to make it safe. So the pond was dug. It took over about 22 acres. It's changed over the years slightly in shape and size and diameter. And if you've been out here recently, you'll see it's changing again. And it was dug, and natural springs that were making the land boggy are filling it up, and it's there. And if you see any kind of streams coming off of it, and there are a few, they're overflows to take water away rather than put water into it. But the Heath, the pond, since it's been dug, has been a lifeblood of the area, but it also encapsulates one of my favourite stories of the Heath, and it kind of encapsulates the problems that I mentioned about the boundaries. So I talked earlier on about how Judith, you call it the lake. Fantastic, that's one vote for lake. Remember, you can comment as to what you call it, and maybe the winner is what I will refer to it as from now on. But the pond or the lake, as we're going to call it for the moment, it kind of encapsulates the problems with the boundaries between Burriton, Petersfield and Sheet, and that is that the boundary of the pond actually cuts across it, or the boundary between Burriton and Petersfield cuts across it, and it cuts across about a third of the way out in that direction, horizontally across. It cuts across, so the larger part towards Butser Hill there and towards the town, that belonged to Petersfield, the borough of Petersfield, and most of the time in the history that we're talking about belonged to the family called the Jolliffes. And this half, the half closest to us, or the third closest to us, that's actually in Burriton, and would belong to the manor of Burriton. And in the story that I'm going to tell, that belonged to the Gibbons. Now, this story, I got to get the date right for it, although I love this story, I need to get this right, is about fishing rights. Now, the different landowners had the right to give permissions for grazing cattle here, taking the turbage or the fuel from the heath, and they also had the rights to the fishing. Now, there was a court case in 1775 in which John Jolliffe, who was the lord of the manor of Petersfield, took two Burton commoners to court in London. It went all the way up into London on charges of poaching of fish, and this was to probably rile up his opponent Gibbon. They were parliamentary MP rivals as well as lords of the manor, and there's histories dotted with them winding each other up. And this is one of those cases. They brought this case. Unfortunately, we don't know the outcome yet. I'm still trying to find that. But what we do know of the details is that the two gentlemen from Burton were accused of taking over 8,000 fish from the pond. Excuse me. And that included 1,000 carp, 1,000 roach, 1,000 trout, 1,000 perch, 1,000 minnows, and I can't remember the others, but 8,000 fish. Now, I think most people I talk to who've done ecological surveys or been fishing in the lake will tell you that the likelihood that there are 8,000 of any species, any species in there, is quite small. So I doubt that it happened, but it's an interesting story, and it really does go to show the problems of the land being split between, in this case, the two lords of the manor of Petersfield and Burton. So it's quite interesting. Just carrying on with the history of the pond, it was dredged in 1934 and again in 1987. So some people might be able to remember that dredging, because I think it took a number of years, and of course we've gone through different things today. We are talking about Petersfield Lake or pond, and we've just saying the debate is whether you call it a lake or a pond, and at the moment we are talking as a lake. The lake, we're going to just carry on. I'm going to flip my camera around again so you can see some of the lovely views with the sun setting. The pond or lake has given its rise to recreational use as well throughout the history of the heath. So obviously one of the most basic, or one of the most obvious things for the pond is obviously for bathing, and bathing is first mentioned in Petersfield pond or lake around 1807, and at times they erected changing tents for people to use, as well as so they'd use it they'd use it for bathing. They erected tents and bathing houses and showers to wash off for, as early as the 1807. We know that during the First World War, just after the First World War, bathing was allowed in the pond before 9 a.m. and after 7 p.m. But there were strict bathing regulations of what you could wear, particularly for the ladies, and they were enforced by the local police to make sure that your ankles weren't indecently on show, and that you were wearing a swimming cap, and all those different things as well. So a very different time. But again, I'm not so sure that I would go swimming in there today. And for those of you who do come to the Petersfield pond or lake, I don't know whether you would want to go swimming in there either. It'd be interesting. Let me know your thoughts. We can see on the pond, hopefully, or the lake, you can just about see the boats. Boating first began in 1895, and it was taken as a surprise that it hadn't been considered earlier on to do boating on the lake. And the reason why it hadn't been done earlier on was that the Jolliffes and the lords of the manor at the time in Burton weren't so keen on the idea of letting people onto their water to do boating, because obviously there'd be issues with possible poaching and things like that. However, what was brought to their attention was that, well, you could sell the rights for people to let people boat on there, and as soon as money was involved, then it suddenly became a thing, and the Jolliffes realised that they could get someone to pay them to allow them to get people to go out on boats on the heath. So very intriguing, and it's not dissimilar now that Petersfield Town Council, the owners of the heath, the custodians of the heath and the owners, still lease out a licence for the boating to happen, I believe. Oh wow, applaud you, Michael, for having been swimming in there. I wonder, was it a pleasant experience? I've been wading in there, and it was very silty, and I almost ended up swimming. But hats off for going in and doing that. Something slightly less obvious to start off with is that the Heath has also been used for ice skating and skating over the years as well. Almost as long as it's been freezing over for, particularly the Victorian period, harsher winters, and the Heath did freeze over more. We have accounts of Churches College playing ice hockey on the Heath, cross-country runners deciding that they're going to go from point A to point B instead of going around the pond as they should do, cutting across the ice, which I think is just a fantastic cheating idea, or use of your initiative, I suppose, depending on which way you look at it, to cut across there. It does have a word of warning that comes with it, and that is that obviously when people go out on the pond, there is always a risk, and there is a tragic story in 1902 where 3 young boys, local boys, did go under the ice and they drowned and did die, despite the best efforts of another Jolliffe at the time and their school friends, but it took them half an hour to take them out. So a poignant story, but a warning to say that, you know, if it does ever freeze over, it's not the safest place to go out, and accidents do happen, so you have to be careful. But we've got pictures of people as late as the 60s going out there, and we have anecdotes of people going out on scramblers on the ice, so it gets nice and thick, the ice at times. But again, this is not me condoning anyone going out there on the ice, just in case anything would happen to you. So we've got the pond, and that just adds to our kind of the history of the Heath. We've gone through the prehistoric nature of it, again going back to possible Paleolithic activity 10,000 years ago, to definite Mesolithic campsite 9,000 years ago, then on to the creation of the heathland itself before the Bronze Age, when it became this fantastic monument to the dead. And what I didn't mention at that point is a lot of the trees that we see around us now wouldn't have been here, and it would have been a flat open place, and the tops of the barrows would have been the sandy soil, so they would have stood out as white beacons across the landscape, so they really would have been had quite an impact. And then from the Bronze Age we go on to quite a quiet spell of human occupation until we get to the medieval period, where it's used by commoners for grazing their animals. And then later on, in order to keep those animals safe, they put in... Oh, thank you very much, Rob. We've got some in the comments there. We've got that from the 18th century onwards, it's nearly always referred to as the pond. So that's fantastic. So I'm afraid that overpips you calling it the lake, Judith, so I'm going to call it from the pond from now on. And I think I personally would call it the pond all the time as well. So we get to the medieval period, commoners using it for grazing, for digging out peat, and causing the problems, which meant that the Heath had to be, the pond had to be dug. And then that's just added to that wonderful rich history that we've got. And another part of the history, along with the pond and the prehistoric landscape and the recreation of the cricket field and all the sports that have gone on, is that of the Taro Fair, or the fair to start off with. There have always been 2 fairs held in Petersfield, or 2 fairs allowed to be held in Petersfield since the town's charter was granted in the 12th century, and a third one was added quite early on, and it was held in October. It's called the Taro Fair. The first solid date that we have for it is 1820, although there's possibly a fair here beforehand, but definite mention of the Taro Fair from 1820. At that time, it was mainly a cattle market, or a cattle fair. It would have been held on this part of the Heath, so we have Heath Road north along there, and we pan around back down towards the town and the festival hall in that direction. By this time as well, the Enclosures Act has happened, so the Heath is now almost the size that it is today. The land around it has been taken up for more arable farming or for houses to be built on, and we get a much smaller heathland. It's nearer the 90 acres it is today rather than the 200 it was in the medieval period. And you've got this cattle fair. 600 cattle would be sold in it roughly in the early days. But then as we go onwards into about the 1850s, we start seeing it grow to about 1,000 cattle, 6,500 sheep. So quite a large fair. And then as we hit the Victorian periods, the early to mid-Victorian period, we then start seeing the introduction of the fun fair to this fair. And we start seeing merry-go-rounds and penny sideshows. So not politically correct term of it, but the freak shows, the bearded ladies and the albinos and the kind of the stereotypical Victorian sideshows were here as part of that fair growing. Merry-go-rounds, you name it, is becoming a large part of the town's year. In fact, so much so that by this point it was a half day on the day of the Tarot Fair, and it would have carried on for about usually 3 days, and for at least one of those everyone would have had the day off. Children would have been out of school, and everyone would have come to the town. By the late 19th century, it becomes a horse fair, which is what most people remember the Tarot Fair for, thanks to the artworks of Flora Twort, who shows all the horses involved in the Tarot Fair, but it's quite late in its history. But again, they would have been here, and we've got memories of horse and cart trap races going up and down the road here, but also in front of where the Festival Hall now is, and all the travellers from the local areas coming here to have their horse fair. And again, that just added... There the motorbike go past. It just added to the vibrancy of the event. The last horses and animals were sold at the fair in 1953, but there is still an annual event fair held. Obviously, unfortunately, not in these times that we find ourselves in, but hopefully it will come back. I started seeing fun fairs around the rest of the country, and there are some connections still with that original Tarot Fair within that fair as well. So it's a fantastic kind of link and a legacy of the area being able to be continuously used for some of that historical events that it has done throughout its life. And that just brings me to kind of more of the modern day, where we get to the Heath being consolidated as one chunk of land. So instead of being owned by two different individuals, two lords of the manors, by 1913, what was then Petersfield Urban District Council, they made an offer to both the Bonham Carters, who were the manorial holders of Burton, and again the Jolliffes, who were by now the Hiltons, Lord Hilton of Petersfield, and they made an offer in 1913 to purchase the rights and the land. It was a long legal process, and there were hiccups along the way, but eventually they purchased it for a price of £1,100. And what that has meant is that the Petersfield Urban District have been able to consolidate and keep the Heath as a common use land. It is somewhere that the public use. In 1975, it was officially or formally recognised as a common land under the 1965 Act of Common Land. I can't remember the exact name of the Act, but it was recognised as common land, and that helps with the protection. Obviously, the now owners, the Petersfield Town Council, have it built in within the neighbourhood plan. It's part of the South Downs planning area as well, so it has lots of protection now in order to keep it safe. The barrows on the Heath, the Bronze Age barrows, the archaeology, they're all registered or scheduled ancient monuments, so they're also protected. So you have all these things which mean that this landscape, this ancient landscape, this landscape with a history which goes back over at least 9,000 years, is safe and it's protected, and the residents of Petersfield can enjoy it, visitors to Petersfield can enjoy it, and I hope that this walk has given you a bit more of an insight into some of that history. hopefully told you something you didn't know before, something to look at next time you're down there, or questions to ask. Now, there's an awful lot of detail, there's an awful lot of history that I've not been able to put in. There's an awful lot of questions that I may not have been able to answer. So please do, if you've got any of those or you'd like to know more, you can go onto the museum's website, and our contact details are on there, and you can send us an email, put it in the comments of the video here, and on Monday I'll try and go through them and answer those questions if I can, or get in touch with more details that I can. So please, an introduction to the history of the Heath, a very quick overview, but if you would like to know more, then please do get in touch in one way or another. And that is it, really. I'm back now. You'll see that we've kind of come full circle, and there's the little school by the lake, or the old golf clubhouse, and I'll flip my camera around. This is the rise there, so it's actually a barrow right in front of us there with all that heather on, and just behind that is our Mesolithic campsite. So we've got our golf house there. Just over behind those trees, our unique cricket ground within the middle of a Bronze Age burial, and on around and back towards the Heath. So I hope you've enjoyed. Like I said, I hope that it's inspired you to find out a little bit more. I would like to thank the South Downs National Park for inviting us to run this video and be part of Secrets of the Heath, even if it's digital this year, and we hope to be back in a physical form next year. But I hope you all have a good evening, and I look forward to seeing some of you at future museum events, or when the museum reopens next year. But thank you very much, and take care. Goodbye.